1941, China. The clouds over Kunming were black with smoke, not from the enemy yet, but from the burning wrecks that had once been China's pride. Factories bombed, airfields cratered, hangars twisted like paper. The Imperial Japanese Air Force ruled the skies, and every Chinese pilot knew taking off was almost the same as saying goodbye. But among them was one man who refused to bow, Captain Huang Wei. He wasn't a legend yet, just another grounded pilot watching his homeland burn. Yet in that silence, surrounded by scrap metal and shattered wings, he began to build the impossible. The year was 1941. Supplies from America hadn't arrived, Soviet aid had dried up, and Japan's bombers came daily like clockwork. Most called it hopeless. Huang called it a challenge. He scavenged every wrecked fuselage, stripped every destroyed engine, and pulled miracles from junkyards. If it once flew, he told his crew, it will fly again. Men laughed at first, calling him crazy. But when he welded the first frame together, something in their fear cracked open. The airbase at Kunming had become a graveyard, yet from its ashes rose a machine of defiance. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even symmetrical, but it was his. Late nights echoed with hammer strikes and coughing generators. Mechanics used kitchen pots as molds, old bicycle chains as gear links, and ration tins for fuel lines. Every piece bore a scar, a reminder of loss turned to purpose. And as the months passed, word spread. The mad pilot was building his own fighter. Some said it would explode before it even left the ground. Others said it was already a symbol that China wasn't finished. When officials came to inspect, they saw a monster of metal patched with colors of a dozen wrecks, tail marked with a crude, hand-painted dragon. They shook their heads and left. Huang just smiled. To him, every rivet was a rebellion, every dent a story. He studied Japanese aircraft manuals scavenged from crashed planes, learning how to outthink the enemy from their own designs. His wife brought him rice balls and tea, whispering, "You'll die in that thing." He'd laugh softly. "Then it'll die fighting, too." The machine began to take shape, a hybrid of dreams and desperation. One morning, under a crimson dawn, he rolled it to the runway. No one cheered. No one believed. He climbed inside, engine coughing like an old beast, smoke hissing from its sides. Soldiers stopped their drills just to stare. With a breath, he pushed the throttle. The contraption shook, wheels bouncing against cracked concrete, dust blinding everyone as the sound roared louder and louder, until, against all logic, it lifted. For the first time in months, something Chinese was flying. Mechanics screamed. Men fell to their knees. Even the wind seemed to stop. From the ground, it looked like a scrap-born bird refusing extinction. Up there, Huang didn't feel the vibration or fear, only freedom. The sky wasn't owned by anyone anymore. As he banked east toward the front lines, he radioed one line that history would later quote, "Tell them, China still fights." And with that, he vanished into the smoke, a lone defiance written across the clouds. The next morning, soldiers waited by the runway, eyes fixed on the horizon, but Huang didn't return. Hours passed. Then, near dusk, a shadow appeared, a broken silhouette limping through the clouds. His plane landed hard, skidding across the cracked concrete until it collapsed in smoke and sparks. Mechanics ran toward it, expecting a corpse. Instead, Huang climbed out laughing, covered in soot and oil. "It flies," he shouted, "and it fights." That single moment spread across China like wildfire. Newspapers printed his name. Villagers whispered it like prayer. In a time when defeat filled every broadcast, he had given the nation something rarer than victory: hope. His superiors, at first skeptical, now saw potential. They ordered him to replicate the aircraft for limited missions. But Huang wasn't after fame or favor. His obsession was survival, for his people, for their skies. He took every scrap, every twisted engine part, every gear salvaged from crash sites, and built more, each plane slightly better than the last, patched together by hands that refused surrender. He named them after the villages destroyed by bombings: Pingxiang, Wuhan, Nanchang. To him, every machine was a memorial in flight. When a visiting American advisor saw one, he reportedly murmured, "This isn't engineering, it's resurrection." But not everyone shared that awe. Japanese intelligence soon learned of the Ghost Squadron, operating from the Chinese mountains. Reports described odd aircraft, half Japanese, half Chinese, that fought with unpredictable tactics. Tokyo dismissed it as rumor, but Japanese pilots in Burma began to speak of strange encounters. Planes built from scrap, outmaneuvering them, appearing from nowhere, disappearing into clouds like phantoms. Huang's creation had become legend, part machine, part myth. His unit, unofficial and underfunded, launched ambushes on Japanese supply convoys, strafing them at dawn before vanishing into the mist. Each sortie risked everything. His engines were temperamental, his ammunition scarce, and his fuel hand-blended from whatever they could scavenge. Yet they kept flying. Every flight was a gamble against gravity and fate. And Huang? He led every mission himself. His men said he never slept, just sat by the plane at night, tightening bolts, whispering to it like an old friend. "You and me," he'd murmur, "will show them metal can have a soul." One day, as American volunteers arrived, the famed Flying Tigers, they were stunned to see what he'd built. Their leader, Claire Chennault, met Huang personally. "You're the man flying junk into legends," Chennault said with a grin. Huang only replied, "Junk is all we have. Legends are what we make." From that day, the Flying Tigers often flew alongside his scrap planes, calling them the Iron Ghosts. Together, they turned the tide in small but symbolic victories. Bridges destroyed, convoys halted, morale reignited. As 1941 drew to an end, one thing became clear. Japan might dominate the skies, but China had found its wings again. And in the center of it all stood a man who had taught an entire nation to believe that courage could be welded from ruin. Before the war, Huang Wei had never imagined becoming a pilot. Born in 1911 near Chengdu, he grew up watching biplanes buzz overhead like strange metal birds. Aviation in China was still in its infancy then. Planes were rare, often seen as curiosities for the wealthy or military elite. But for Huang, they were freedom itself. As a child, he built paper models and flew them off rooftops, sometimes breaking bones, never breaking spirit. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, his life's path took shape. He enlisted in the newly formed Chinese Air Force, training under foreign instructors who taught him not just how to fly, but how to survive. They called him quiet, but relentless. The kind of student who'd stay in the cockpit long after class, adjusting controls, memorizing every sound an engine made. By 1937, when full-scale war erupted, he had already fought in the Battle of Shanghai. His squadron lost over half its men in the first month. He saw friends burn, cities fall, skies filled with smoke. Yet even as his planes dwindled, his resolve hardened. When the Japanese bombers struck Chongqing relentlessly in 1940, he was among those tasked with defending the last unbroken cities. He flew outdated Curtiss Hawks, patched so often they looked like patchwork quilts. When his last one was destroyed during a bombing raid, his superiors ordered him to stand down. "No aircraft, no flight," they said. But Huang didn't understand that phrase. To him, flight wasn't privilege. It was duty. He roamed the ruined hangars, gathering twisted propellers, bullet-riddled wings, melted struts. Each one whispered the same thing: "Not over yet." The ground crew thought he'd lost his mind when he started sketching designs on torn blueprints. He mixed American and Japanese parts, experimented with hybrid engines, and spent sleepless nights testing torque by hand. When mechanics protested, "This will never fly," he simply smiled. Neither did they say China would survive. In those days, fuel was rationed tighter than gold. Ammunition came from downed planes or smuggled caches. Every mission meant gambling with mechanical failure. Yet Huang refused to give up. His men began to follow his madness, not because they believed in the plane, but because they believed in him. Even government officials, though dismissive at first, couldn't ignore the morale his project inspired. They called him the engineer of dust. To him, that was enough. He didn't dream of medals or fame, only flight. His journals, later found in 1952, revealed his mindset. If the sky is lost, the land will fall. But if even one plane rises, then the sky still remembers us. That belief drove him through exhaustion, injury, and hunger. Sometimes, while scavenging wrecks, he found personal letters among the debris, notes from pilots who never came back. He'd fold them gently and place them in the cockpit of his scrap plane, as if giving them one last flight. His creation became more than a weapon. It was a monument in motion. The backdrop of his story wasn't just a war, it was a country on its knees, held up by a handful of dreamers who refused to crawl. And Huang, standing amid ashes and metal, was about to give them something unthinkable. Hope that still had wings. By the winter of 1941, China was in ruins. Entire cities like Nanjing and Wuhan lay in rubble, and millions had fled inland to escape Japanese control. The nationalist government relocated to Chongqing, struggling to maintain order, and the Air Force, once a symbol of progress, was reduced to a handful of battered squadrons. Supplies trickled in from Burma and India, but nowhere near enough to match Japan's industrial power. The American Lend-Lease program was only beginning, and for pilots like Huang Wei, survival meant improvisation. What most saw as trash, he saw as potential. Old Japanese Kai-27 engines, captured from downed fighters, were combined with American propeller blades salvaged from Curtiss wrecks. The fuselage? Pieces of tin roofs, torn-off car doors, even melted steel from bombed bridges. Huang's small workshop inside a bombed hangar became a laboratory of defiance. Every clang of his hammer was a protest. Every spark that flew was a declaration. China still fights. The mechanics who joined him were farmers, blacksmiths, and former students who'd never seen an airplane before. But under his guidance, they became engineers overnight. He trained them by torchlight, explaining aerodynamics with broken rulers and chalk lines on the floor. They had no wind tunnels, no instruments, no spare fuel, only faith. Even the smell of gasoline became sacred. The local villagers started sneaking him parts, bolts, and metal scraps, calling his workshop the Cave of Wings. Children brought him bicycle tires, hoping they'd help the planes take off faster. And in return, Huang painted dragons on their kites, promising, "One day we'll all fly." Yet every breakthrough came with a cost. The Japanese bombers returned weekly, and each time they did, Huang's base was hit again. His crew buried their dead and rebuilt again and again. His wife, May, stitched flight suits from old blankets, washing off soot and blood at the nearby stream. When asked why she stayed, she said softly, "Because he believes enough for both of us." During that same winter, a young officer named Lin Tao joined his unit. Lin would later write, "It wasn't a plane factory. It was a shrine built on willpower." He described Huang's first test flight, how the plane shuddered like it might break apart at any second, yet somehow stayed in the air. To those who watched, it wasn't just metal flying, it was China refusing to die. Word spread beyond borders. American observers in Burma sent back notes about Chinese scrap fighters haunting the skies near Yunnan. Some called them suicidal. Others called them a miracle. Huang ignored both labels. To him, it was neither madness nor genius. It was necessity. In a war fought with technology, he used humanity as his weapon. His scrap planes were ugly, unpredictable, often smoking mid-flight. But they terrified Japanese patrols who couldn't predict where or when they'd appear. And in the chaos of 1941's final months, that chaos became his greatest ally. The legend of the dragon from junk had been born. What began as a desperate experiment was now on the verge of rewriting China's aerial resistance. By early 1942, the war in the Pacific had erupted beyond anyone's control. Japan had conquered vast stretches of Asia, and China, bleeding, starving, but still defiant, stood as one of the last barriers to full domination. Huang Wei's handmade squadron, now consisting of 3 barely functional aircraft, was stationed in the mountains near Kunming. The planes were crude, their engines unpredictable, and their wings shivered in flight. But for Huang and his men, they weren't machines. They were miracles. Each flight risked death not only from the enemy but from their own creation. The mechanics had to hand-start engines using iron rods. Sometimes they caught fire before takeoff. Yet every time the alarm sirens wailed, Huang was the first to climb in. On January 11, 1942, intelligence reported that a Japanese bomber group was en route to destroy a supply depot in Yunnan. With no functional interceptors available, command gave no orders. Huang made his own. He called his men together and simply said, "If we can't stop them, we can still make them bleed." The pilots saluted. No one hesitated. The sky that morning was gray, heavy with ash and cold. As the Japanese bombers appeared, a formation of 9 Mitsubishi G-3Ms escorted by fighters, Huang's 3 scrap planes roared to life. From the ground, it looked suicidal. 3 misfits charging into a sky owned by the Empire. His radio crackled with static. "Huang, the wings won't hold," someone yelled. "Then fly before they fall," he shouted back. The first clash was chaos. The enemy pilots were stunned. What they faced didn't even look like aircraft. One Japanese ace later wrote in his diary, "They looked like flying corpses, stitched from war's remains. Yet they fought like demons." Huang's team dove straight into the formation, firing wildly, guns jamming, engines sputtering. He hit one bomber dead on, shredding its right wing. Another scrap plane burst into flames but kept ramming forward until it clipped a Japanese escort. 2 aircraft spiraled down together in fire. On the ground, villagers who witnessed the battle thought they were watching falling stars. By the time Huang landed, barely, the airfield was a wreck of twisted metal and smoke. 2 of his men never returned. But 6 Japanese bombers had gone down. Command didn't believe the report at first. They called it luck, coincidence, myth. But the photographs told another story. Shattered bombers scattered across the mountains, proof that his madness worked. For the first time, Japanese Air Command issued a formal notice to identify and neutralize the mysterious Chinese pilots flying improvised aircraft. They didn't realize yet that it wasn't about the planes. It was about the will behind them. After the mission, Huang didn't celebrate. He stood by the wreckage of his comrades' planes, eyes empty. "They gave their lives for scrap," a mechanic whispered. Huang corrected him quietly. "No, they gave scrap a life." That night, he returned to the hangar, silent, hammering alone under the lantern glow. For him, grief was fuel. The war wasn't over, and neither was he. In the weeks that followed, Huang Wei's legend began to spread, first among the soldiers, then the civilians, and finally the enemy. Stories said he could fly anything, that he could turn ruins into wings. The truth was far grittier. Supplies had run out entirely. The Americans were still months away from delivering aid through the hump, and China's army was bleeding dry. Huang scavenged everything: broken trucks, train scraps, even stovepipes to reinforce wings. His hands were always black with soot, his uniform stitched a dozen times. But every sunrise he made sure a plane flew. The Japanese began sending specialized hunter units to track him. Their radio operators intercepted his calls, mocking him as the Scrap Ghost. The name stuck, and Huang wore it like armor. He didn't fight for medals. He fought because surrender meant extinction. One icy dawn in February 1942, a scout plane spotted a massive Japanese convoy heading through the mountain pass near Tengchong. It carried fuel, weapons, and prisoners, Chinese laborers bound for forced camps. Huang's command refused to risk what few planes remained. "It's suicide," they said. He only smiled. "Then I'll die awake." That night, he and his remaining crew, 2 pilots, one barely 20, prepared their machines. They named them Hope, Echo, and Ghost. The engines groaned like dying beasts as they warmed, but Huang whispered to them like old friends. The airfield crew wept silently as they launched. No one expected to see them return. As the moon rose, the 3 planes ascended over the mountains, their patchwork bodies glinting faintly. The Japanese convoy below moved steadily. Dozens of trucks, guarded by anti-air batteries. The first dive came from the clouds. Huang released a makeshift bomb, a repurposed artillery shell tied to his wing. It hit the lead truck dead center, erupting into fire. Chaos exploded across the convoy. Soldiers scrambled, shouting into radios. But no one could believe what they saw. Scrap planes attacking from the dark. Huang's team split formation, strafing low. Bullets tore through the night, tracer fire lighting up the hills like fireworks. One of his men took a hit. His plane began spinning out. "Ghost, go!" he shouted through static. But Huang dove after him, trying to guide him out of the flames. The burning plane crashed beside the convoy, exploding in a blast that lit the valley. The shockwave ripped through the Japanese line, scattering trucks into ditches. Prisoners broke their chains and fled into the forest. Huang, barely controlling his own aircraft, turned and fired his last burst at the rear guard. Then silence. The fight was over. When he landed hours later, his plane's propeller was gone. The fuselage half melted. He'd glided the final miles in darkness. The base was speechless. The convoy was destroyed. Hundreds of captives saved. Command finally recognized him, but Huang refused any promotion. "I'm not done," he said. "Scrap can still fly." From then on, his unit became a symbol, painted on walls, whispered in trenches. Mothers told their children about the man who made wings out of wreckage. But fame came with a price. Japan's military marked him as a high-priority target. Pilots were ordered to bring back his head, not his plane. Every battle grew deadlier, every mission shorter. Still, Huang flew. His eyes hollowed, his hands trembled from exhaustion. But when the alarm siren screamed, he never hesitated. By March 1942, the Scrap Squadron had become both a myth and a nightmare. They'd shot down more aircraft than any regular Chinese unit, without ever flying a factory-made machine. But deep down, Huang knew the end was near. The supplies were gone, his men dwindling. He once said to a young mechanic, "When there's nothing left, that's when you find out what kind of pilot you are." That line became their creed, scrawled in chalk across their hangar wall. And though the world didn't know it yet, Huang was about to make his final flight, the one that would turn his name from rumor into legend. March 1941, the Chinese pilot now flew a plane that shouldn't have existed. Every bolt, every scrap of metal screamed defiance. It rattled like a dying engine, yet somehow roared when he pulled the throttle. He named it the Ghost Hawk. It wasn't official. No government order. No engineer's plan. Just pure desperation turned into wings. The Japanese had numbers, fuel, and factories. He had junk and fury. That morning, he saw the rising sun flags spreading over the valley, their fighters moving in perfect formation. His squadron was gone. His base was in ruins. But the Ghost Hawk was ready. He strapped himself in, his hands trembling but his eyes steady. He didn't pray. He just muttered, "Let's see if you can bleed." As he took off, the villagers below watched in disbelief. A plane made of scraps, lifting against the wind, against reason. The Japanese pilots laughed when they saw it. One even radioed, "Enemy craft looks like it's falling apart already." But that laugh died quick. The Ghost Hawk dived at impossible speed, nose first, into their formation. It wasn't power, it was madness that drove it. He twisted the plane through gunfire, the bullets punching holes through patched metal, smoke pouring from the wings. But he didn't stop. He got behind one fighter, fired the old half-jammed gun, and somehow, impossibly, one enemy burst into flame. "One down," he whispered. He banked hard, the controls screaming, and lined up another. 2, 3. The sky became chaos. Metal rain, smoke, and shattered pride. Japanese pilots couldn't believe a plane built from trash was tearing through them. The Ghost Hawk took hits, lost oil pressure, lost a wing flap, but he still pressed on. His oxygen mask cracked, his vision blurred, but every enemy he saw was one step closer to vengeance. When a Zero came head-on, he didn't dodge. He fired straight, both planes colliding in a flash of fire and twisted steel. For seconds, there was silence. The smoke drifted, and from it, the Ghost Hawk fell, but not dead. He regained control inches before the ground, the wreckage somehow obeying him. His heart pounded like an engine about to burst. He circled back to base, or what was left of it, and saw the villagers waving flags made from sheets. They thought he'd been destroyed. But the man who refused to die was still flying. He radioed one line before landing. "Scrap or not, it flies." The Chinese resistance would tell that story for years. The man who took junk metal and turned it into terror for the Japanese skies. The Ghost Hawk was no miracle. It was proof that courage could be welded together from ruins. That day, the legend was born. The next morning, smoke still hung over the valley like bruises on the sky. The Ghost Hawk rested crooked in the mud, wings half burnt, but its pilot was already working again. He scavenged the wrecks of fallen enemy planes, prying off panels, yanking wires, hammering broken metal into shape. Every sound of hammer on steel echoed like defiance. There was no rest, no spare parts, no backup crew, just his stubborn will and the ghosts of his fallen comrades. The villagers brought him oil, torn fabric, even cooking pots that he melted down for patches. "If it can bend, it can fly," he said. When the sun rose, the Japanese returned. Bombers in formation, escorted by a dozen fighters. The villagers ran for the caves, praying. The pilot didn't pray. He climbed back into the Ghost Hawk, now stitched together with hope and madness. The engine sputtered like a dying heartbeat, then roared to life again. Against orders, he launched into the sky. Every second felt borrowed. He climbed into the sunlight, straight toward the bombers. The first wave opened fire. Tracers lit the air like red rain, but he kept going. He rolled beneath them, came up behind, and fired the machine gun until the barrel glowed. One bomber caught fire, tumbled from the formation, and exploded in the valley below. The second one followed minutes later. The Japanese commander couldn't understand. "How is one plane doing this?" He barked over the radio. But the truth was simple. He was flying not with skill, but with desperation sharpened by loss. The Ghost Hawk took another hit, half its rudder gone, fuel leaking, wings trembling. But he refused to turn back. He saw a Japanese Zero chasing him, its guns flashing. Instead of running, he pulled the stick, climbed vertically, the old engine screaming. The Zero followed, right into the sun. In that blinding light, the pilot flipped his plane upside down and dived behind the attacker. One burst, one kill. The radio went silent again. The surviving Japanese planes retreated, shaken by what they couldn't explain. When he landed, the Ghost Hawk finally died, its engine coughing out one last breath before silence. The villagers rushed out, carrying him on their shoulders, chanting his name. He didn't smile. He just looked at the wreck and said softly, "You did what no one believed you could." That night, word spread through the countryside. A single pilot had stopped an air raid with a plane made of scrap. The story reached every camp, every corner of resistance. It wasn't about one man anymore. It became a symbol. The Japanese never attacked that valley again. Some say they feared the ghost hawk would rise once more. History didn't record his name clearly, but his story lived in whispers and old photographs of a man who turned junk into justice and wreckage into wings. Weeks passed, and the valley that once echoed with air raids now stood silent. The wreck of the Ghost Hawk sat like a shrine at the edge of the airfield, wings charred but spirit unbroken. Soldiers from nearby units came to see it, tracing their hands along the patchwork metal, whispering about the man who'd built it. They said his plane wasn't made from steel, it was made from defiance. The story reached Chinese command, then spread across Allied frequencies. Reports called it an improvised miracle, though the pilot himself dismissed that word. It wasn't a miracle, he said. It was a message. When asked what message, he replied, that we'll fight with whatever's left. Those words hit like a spark in dry grass. Across China, grounded mechanics began building again. From farm tools, old trucks, crashed aircraft, even furniture. Dozens of makeshift planes appeared along the front lines. They couldn't outfly Japan's Zeros, but they could strike when no one expected. The movement became known as the scrap wings. Pilots who once thought defeat was certain now saw hope welded together from rust. Each sortie became an act of defiance. The Japanese command grew frustrated. Their intelligence officers couldn't understand how villages with no factories were launching air raids. The pilot of the Ghost Hawk, now limping from burns and shrapnel, trained new recruits. He taught them not to fear failure. Every crash is just another lesson, he'd say. He refused promotions, medals, or rest. His only demand, fuel and scrap. The resistance began winning small victories, cutting off supply convoys, bombing outposts, slowing Japan's advance. Allied officers visiting from Burma and India wrote in disbelief about what they saw. They fight with skeletons of planes, yet somehow they win, one wrote. The pilot's legend grew, not just as a fighter, but as a builder, a leader who proved that courage didn't come from machinery, but from men. By autumn, word of the Ghost Hawk had reached the United States. Photographs circulated in newspapers, a ragged pilot beside his patched plane. American engineers studied the design, amazed that it had stayed airborne at all. But for the Chinese resistance, that wreck was sacred. Children left flowers beneath its broken propeller. Every story told around campfires began the same way. There was once a man who refused to surrender. His example spread beyond war. It became an idea that even when the world gives you scraps, you can still rise. By winter 1941, the Ghost Hawk's story had traveled farther than any of its bullets. Allied newspapers in London, Washington, and Delhi carried headlines calling it the plane that shouldn't have flown. Yet in the valley where it all began, the pilot remained quiet, refusing attention. He spent his nights helping farmers repair tools, teaching young mechanics how to weld, reminding them that machines are only as strong as the hands that believe in them. But deep down, he knew his time was running out. His burns worsened, his lungs filled with smoke from months of flying damaged engines, yet he refused to leave the front. One morning, word came that a Japanese column was advancing toward the valley again. Tanks, trucks, and infantry. There were no working aircraft left. The villagers panicked, but the pilot just looked at the rusting Ghost Hawk and said, "One more time." They told him it couldn't fly. He answered, "Neither could it the first time." Through the night, he and a handful of villagers worked under lanterns, patching holes with sheet metal, sealing cracks with resin, tightening bolts with makeshift tools. By dawn, the Ghost Hawk stood ready, or as ready as broken dreams could be. He climbed in, started the engine, and the entire valley fell silent. The roar returned, weak, uneven, but alive. As he lifted off, the crowd below wept. The Japanese convoy moved through the mountain pass, unaware of what was coming. Out of the morning haze came the ghost hawk, wings trembling, engines screaming, but heart unstoppable. He dove straight into the center of the column, dropping improvised explosives made from oil drums and gasoline. The explosion tore through trucks and tanks, scattering the enemy line. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, hitting his plane repeatedly. Smoke poured from the cockpit. Still, he made another pass, one final strike. Flames rose across the valley, and for a moment, it seemed like the ghosts of every fallen pilot flew beside him. His last radio message came through static. "Tell them, it flew again!" The plane vanished behind the ridge in a burst of fire. When villagers reached the crash site, they found only wreckage, but also the bodies of Japanese soldiers still burning from the attack. The Ghost Hawk was gone, but the legend had become immortal. Allied officers later confirmed that his final strike delayed Japan's advance in that region by several weeks, giving Chinese forces critical time to regroup. In history books, it was just a line, a footnote in the chaos of war. But for the people of that valley, it was proof that even in ruins, resistance could still rise. Every year afterward, villagers painted a white hawk on their doors to remember him, not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as the man who refused to let the impossible stay impossible. When the smoke finally cleared and the winter winds swept across the ruined valley, there was nothing left of the Ghost Hawk except melted aluminum and twisted wire. But legends don't die with their wreckage. Word of the lone pilot spread beyond China, reaching soldiers in distant fronts who had never seen his face, yet swore they fought braver after hearing his name. They said he had shown the world what courage looked like when stripped of everything else. No uniform glory, no perfect machines, just willpower turned to wings. Allied reporters tried to find his records, but even military archives had no full name. Some files listed him only as the Scrap Pilot. Others called him the Ghost Maker. Yet in the villages that fed and sheltered him, old men told the story differently. They said he wasn't one man at all. He was every man who refused to stop fighting. The valley where he fell became a symbol of defiance. Each spring, when the wheat turned gold, children would trace small hawks in the dust and whisper, "It flew again!" The legend inspired new engineers and pilots, many of whom designed aircraft years later for the People's Republic, crediting the nameless pilot who proved invention was born from survival. By 1943, the Allies had turned the tide. Japanese dominance in the air began to crumble, and Chinese squadrons, better equipped now, painted ghost hawks on their planes in tribute. The symbol meant more than rebellion. It meant rebirth. But historians still debate how much of his story was true. Some claim he really destroyed 7 enemy planes with that patched-together wreck. Others say only 2. A few skeptics insist it was propaganda. But numbers never mattered. What mattered was the spark. The idea that one determined man could make the sky tremble with nothing but broken parts and belief. When Allied commanders toured the region after the war, they found pieces of the Ghost Hawk's propeller embedded in a hillside, preserved by villagers like relics of a saint. They tried to move them to a museum, but the locals refused. "It belongs to the sky," they said. That was the spirit he left behind. Not in steel, but in hearts that refused surrender. The war raged on elsewhere, but in that valley, the people no longer looked up in fear. They looked up in pride. For them, the sound of an engine was not a threat anymore. It was a promise that hope could fly even when the world was burning. Years later, when peace finally came, the valley where the Ghost Hawk once flew remained untouched by time. The grass grew tall over the old runway, but the villagers kept one patch clear, marked by a rusted wing fragment standing upright like a monument. Every spring, they gathered there, farmers, children, even soldiers long retired, to light candles and tell the story again. The elders would begin the same way. Once, there was a man who refused to let the sky belong to the enemy. Young ones would listen wide-eyed, imagining the rattle of engines and the blaze of courage in a world that had forgotten mercy. The war had ended, but its scars were everywhere. Burned fields, lost families, names etched on stone. Yet this one story healed something that history books could not. It reminded people that victory is not always measured in numbers or medals, but in the moments when someone stands up and says, "Not yet." Decades later, when a new generation of Chinese pilots trained in modern jets, they visited the valley to pay respect. The government had built a memorial there, small and simple, a bronze hawk mounted on a pedestal of welded scrap metal. At the base, a single inscription read, "It flew again." No name, no rank, no photograph, just the legend. Old villagers said that on some nights, when fog rolled down from the hills, you could hear an engine sputtering faintly in the distance, as if the ghost hawk still circled overhead, guarding the land it once saved. Pilots swore that during storm flights, their radios sometimes crackled with static shaped like words. Keep flying. Maybe it was myth, maybe it was memory, but even the skeptics felt it. The idea that courage never dies, it only changes form. The legacy of the Ghost Hawk was never about one man or one machine. It was about the will to fight when the world says you can't. In museums, the fragments of his plane still glint under glass, humble yet holy. Visitors stand silent before them, realizing they're not looking at wreckage. They're looking at proof that humanity's greatest weapon isn't technology. It's defiance. The war that birthed his legend ended in ashes, but from those ashes rose a truth carved into history. Even the weakest hands can shape destiny when they refuse to let go. And as long as there are skies to fly, someone, somewhere, will look up and whisper the same words that started it all. Scrap or not, it flies.